The story of Japan begins with a dance. In the beginning there was chaos, then deities emerged from the primordial ooze, and after 7 generations, 2 brother and sister gods, Izanagi and Izanami, were born. Commanded by the older gods to form order from the chaos, they descended from heaven on a rainbow bridge. Izanagi dipped his spear in the oily primordial mass, and drops fell from its tip and formed the islands of Japan. Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Lesley Downer. Lesley is a Japan specialist, a writer, historian, geisha expert, and novelist. Throughout her career, she spent around 15 years in Japan, and much longer reading, researching, and writing about the place. Lesley has published more than a dozen books on the topics of Japanese poetry, cooking, court life, and the span of Japanese history. Earlier this year, the publishing house Elan put out a new edition of Lesley's first book, which is called On the Narrow Road to the Deep North, A Journey into Lost Japan. She joins me today for a discussion about her career as a writer and a book she published in 2024 called The Shortest History of Japan, a concise and beautifully written book about 16,000 years of Japanese history. And now I bring you Lesley Downer. So Lesley, I read that your mother was Chinese and your father was a scholar and speaker of Chinese. When you were growing up, did you have a chance to learn some of the language?
I know a very little Cantonese, but very, very, very not much. My father also was a China scholar. So my father, he knew Mandarin, he knew Hakka, he knew Cantonese, but obviously I was, growing up in England, so basically not. No.
Your mother was in Saskatchewan. How did she end up in England? Did she go there for work or university, or did she meet your father somewhere out in the world and then go to England?
So she after the war, she worked in Statistics Canada in Ottawa, and then she was on a train on her way out of Ottawa to Toronto, where her siblings, some of her one of her sisters were, and She found 2 seats together, and she thought, this is great, I'll be able to sleep. And then this sailor came and sat down next to her anyway and started chatting her up, and that was my dad. So the rest is history. And then my dad was for inexplicable reasons. He was just a normal Canadian boy, but he spent all his time in Chinese laundries learning Chinese from the people that ran the Chinese laundries, and his parents thought there was really something badly wrong with him. And so when he met my Chinese mum, he was incredibly excited. And so then he proposed to her. Mm-hmm. Then he ended up at the School of Oriental Studies in London, and she came with him, basically.
I read from your biography that you grew up in a house full of books about Asia. Could you tell me about some of that upbringing or your fascination with reading those books?
So basically, my father was a China specialist, and so a lot of these books were actually Chinese books. So there was also the 53 Stages of the Tokaido, which I have to this day. I rescued it from the house. So there were books about Japan, obviously lots of books about China. A lot of them were not books I could read because they were in Chinese. But also my father had Chinese friends who were his colleagues at the School of Oriental and African Studies. So Asia was all around, which was actually unusual in the suburbs of London at that time.
And I learned that you joined some program called the Wolfers Scheme, and that's how you ended up going to Japan. Could you tell me how that opportunity unfolded?
I can step a little bit back from that. After I finished university, I really loved pottery. And I became a potter. I made pots, and I read a book by Bernard Leach called A Potter's Book, which is all about the Japanese Mingei movement and about Japanese pottery. Bernard Leach is very famous in Japan. He's not particularly famous here, I don't think. He's not unfamous. So I was aware of Japanese pottery, And this was the 1970s. It was a wonderful time, entirely different from modern times, which are getting a bit dark. It was a really bright time. And I was eating lots of Japanese food. I was macrobiotic. I was eating tofu and miso and all of that. I was into Buddhism, so I was into Zen. I didn't have any money, and then I wanted to make some money because I wanted to buy a leech wheel. I wanted to buy a potter's wheel. So I got a job teaching English in an English school, and one of my students was Japanese, and he asked if I would help him with his English, and he said he had no money. Nobody had any money in those days. And he said he could give me Japanese lessons in exchange. So I said, sure, why not? Meanwhile, there was a man called Nicholas Wolfers, whom I know to this day, and he had the very brilliant idea of sending out English people, as opposed to Americans, young people under the age of 30, to Japan to teach in schools and universities, as opposed to language schools, and to teach not in Tokyo. So, in other words, up until then, all the teachers had been Americans. They'd been working in language schools in Tokyo. So his idea was, no, let's get graduates who are not going to be, language teachers for the rest of their lives, but who just want to have a year in Japan, to go to Japan. So that was known as the Wolfers scheme. And then after I went out on the very first year, there were 22 of us, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. It's now called the Japan English Teachers Program. It's the JET program. But that began with Nicholas Wolfers, and mine was the very first year. And there were 22 of us, and something like 16 were at schools, and 6 of us were in universities or in industry. So one guy was in Suntory, in Osaka, and I was in a university. I was in a Joshidai. I was in a women's university in Gifu. So while the people teaching in schools taught, 50 weeks of the year, Monday to Saturday, from 8 in the morning till 6 at night, I taught 6 months of the year. And I had 6 months holiday because it was a university. And I worked Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday morning, and Thursday morning. And other than that, it was all my own time. So I had a totally different and really wonderful experience. And we all got paid the same amount. So I was very lucky in that school.
And how long did you stay at that job?
So I stayed for 2 years. Yeah, some of those people are still there. Some are still there. The trouble was Gifu was the middle of nowhere, and I was the only gaijin. I did eventually track down some other gaijin, but there weren't very many. There were 3 of us, I think. No, 4. Besides 4, including me, and it was fine. I learned Japanese. I picked up Japanese, so my Japanese is a little bit ropey, but it's extremely functional. The other teachers who were Japanese, they were teaching English, and one of them had written a whole thesis about Walt Whitman, but their spoken English was terrible. It was awful. It was really, really stilted. It was just terrible. So I couldn't have a normal conversation. So I was driven to learn Japanese just so I could have a decent conversation. I mean, the conversations were all about me in English. They were like, why are you vegetarian? Your parents must be very proud of you. It was awful. So I learned Japanese as fast as I possibly could. And I learned key phrases like, Mado wa karanai. Like, I don't know yet, because people kept saying, what are you doing tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning? And I wanted to be able to say, I don't know. So it went from there. My Japanese, as I said, it's very functional. It's a bit rusty right now, but it's very functional, which was good, I suppose.
Yeah, I saw in that documentary that you were the host of a Lost, I'm going to forget the name of it, Lost Journey?
Oh, Lost Japan, Journey to a Lost Japan. Yeah.
Journey to Lost Japan. And not only were you speaking Japanese, but also writing haikus in there.
Oh, that's true.
I thought that was very impressive.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you, how did you, or when did you decide that you wanted to write a travel book and follow in the footsteps of Basho and his narrow road to the deep north?
My whole life has been a series of accidents. Some people know what they want to do. I didn't have a clue, and I didn't know I wanted to be a writer. So I just was getting on with having a life. And after about 5 years in Japan, I finally decided it was time to come home. And I came back to England, and I had never lived in London before. I lived in Oxford for quite a long time. So I lived in London. I didn't really know anybody, but I got to know people. And I got invited to parties, and people would ask what I did. And I started really to dread that question. This is the early 1980s, and there was a very different attitude towards Japan. And most people had never heard of Japan. They would start telling me about Japan, and they'd say things like, oh, Japanese are all exactly the same, aren't they? And they're terribly polite, and they bow all the time, and they imitate. They've got no individuality at all. And then they went on about World War One and about World War Two, rather, and about Japanese eating whales. So I just started to think, this is nothing to do with Japan at all. And I started to think I would like to write a book. So that was part of it, was just thinking I want to write about real Japan. And I'd done a lot of hitchhiking in Japan. I'd been all over the place. And I'm not one for the big city. I wasn't. So I'd spent, lots of time sort of in little country towns up in Hokkaido, and then also went the other way down to Okinawa. So I'd done a lot of stuff off the beaten track in Japan. Oh, and then here I was back in England, and I hadn't done the one thing I had really wanted to do, because you just forget. You're in the middle of living and you forget. And I thought, gosh, I'd really wanted to actually go around the narrow road to the deep north, and I never did. So I thought, okay, let's bring those two things together. So I thought perhaps I could write a book about this, which would also possibly generate a small book advance, which would help my usually appalling financial situation. So I then did get a commission from a publisher, which is a bit frightening, because then you know you've got to do it. So the real motivation was, how can I get back to Japan? That was the big motivation. And I got back.
And so in 2024, you published The Shortest History of Japan. How did the opportunity to write this book come along? Was it something that you sought out, or did the people who published this series invite you to do it?
Yeah. So there's been a big, between those two events, lots of other things that happened. And have written quite a lot of other books about Japan, and went back and forth between England and Japan. At one point when I wrote a book about Geisha, and I became friendly with a travel writer called Piko Aya, who lives in Nara. And we were chums. We still are chums. We're great friends. And at some point, I think the people that do the Shortest History series wanted to do a Japan book, and he said to them that they should come to me. So in this particular case, it came from them. My previous books, I would have an idea and I'd put it to a publisher. But this book, the publisher came to me, and I thought about it for quite a long time. I wasn't sure that I wanted to do it, because I just thought, do I want to write a book which is one in a series, as opposed to my other books, which are all, unique individual books? And also, it sounds like a lot of hard work. And I keep thinking, I've had enough of writing. I want to have a rest. So I thought that too. I thought I want to have a rest. And I then consulted various friends, and they said, no, don't be silly, do it. So in the end, I thought, well, okay, I'll do it. So then I agreed. But I did ask for quite a long time. I think they wanted it done in 6 months or something. And I said, ridiculous, this is the whole history of Japan. So I then settled down to write it. I also realized that I know a lot of different sections of Japanese history through books I've done and TV I've done and things I've done. So, for example, the 4 novels I wrote are all set during the Bakumatsu period. They're all set in the kind of period between Commodore Perry and the so-called Meiji Restoration. So I knew that bit really well. And then there's a series called Age of Samurai, which is on Netflix, and they'd interviewed me for that. So for that, I'd had to bone up on Oda Nobunaga and Hideyoshi and Tokugawa. And so I knew that bit. And then just in my reading, I'm very obsessive about Japanese literature, and I'd read all about the Heian period, so I knew about that. So there was, and so the other thing was, I thought about where to begin. this book. And I told you I'd been a potter. I love Jomon pottery. And I discovered that the Japanese, the people living in Japan BC, we call the Jomon, were the world's first potters. So I thought, well, obviously I have to begin there.
I had no idea that they were so far ahead of every other society and culture. Going back 15,000 or 16,000 years, where they've found pottery from them.
Yes.
And the word Jomon, it comes from how they made their pottery?
It means rope design. It's not how they made it, it's the design. They didn't use a wheel, so they hand-built their pottery, but they did this kind of design with lots of what looked like ropes in it. And it's very spectacular, Jomon pottery. It's really amazing. I don't think there's any in Hokkaido, but there's a lot in Aomori, and there's Jomon settlements. I mean, these were amazing people. They came over the land bridge from Siberia, which was, because it was the Ice Age, the sea levels had dropped, and so there was didn't look like a bridge, it looked like a huge tract of land, and so they would be roaming, and they'd be kind of hunting, giant boar or giant deer or whatever, and they would just be heading east. They were hunter-gatherers, and then at some point along that way, they started to make pots, and this was like the most phenomenal technology. It was like way more revolutionary than the internet, because you could, for the first time, you can store your food. You can have food which is inedible, raw, like chestnuts, and you can cook it and then you can eat it. So your diet's much wider. Cooked food means that apparently you digest cooked food much more quickly. And they could also make soft food to feed babies so that they could wean the babies earlier. So there they were with their pots, and they were still hunter-gatherers. They were still moving around. And then the Ice Age came to an end, and so that meant that the sea levels rose because it became warmer. So then there's no more land bridge. So then there they are, they're cut off, and they're in Japan. But Japan was like kind of paradise. It was like the climate became really temperate. So they have like fruit on the trees, and they have kind of mushrooms, and they have wild food on the ground, and they have deer and boar that they can hunt, and then they have fish in the ocean. So in most societies, hunter-gatherers do not settle down. They're busy hunter-gathering the whole time. But people usually do not settle down until they start farming. But these people were so successful as hunter-gatherers that they actually settled down, and they made communities, and they made houses, very nice houses with thatched roofs. And they also could specialize. Not everybody had to go out hunting the whole time. So some became specialist potters. And so they made these beautiful pots.
And there's a theory that they used to extract teeth as part of a cultural ritual. Why do we think that that's what they were doing?
Oh, that's a difficult one to answer. I mean, I think we have found skulls with the teeth gone, with the teeth missing. I think it was the front teeth, wasn't it? But I'm not sure. I don't know why. I mean, I think anthropologists or archaeologists always say ritual, don't they, as a kind of, catch-all thing. They tattooed themselves. Right. Because, they made wonderful figurines. They didn't just make sort of container pots. They made lots of figurines as well. And you can tell from those figurines what sort of things they wore. I think archaeologists have also found they wove. They also made clothing out of, I think, beaten bark. They probably did quite a lot of things that we associate with Shinto. I mean, they had festivals, they had dancing. I think that also musical instruments have been found. So they had... Yeah, and I think, I think they tied their hair back. So there is a fair bit is known, not by me personally, but by archaeologists about the kind of lifestyle they had. And also they were very successful. I mean, they existed between about, say, 14,500 BC till after AD had begun, when the Yayoi came over, or the people who we call the Yayoi, when people started emigrating from Korea.
And these are the people that brought the rice cultivation techniques to the Japanese islands?
Yeah, but what happened was that initially some of these people turned up in Kyushu, and they were busy, hoeing the soil and so on. And the Jomon really didn't need to bother. I mean, if you could go and you could pick your food off the trees and catch it in the ocean, why should you? And then apart from that, you could be having festivals and dancing. Why would you bother sort of slogging away growing rice? But eventually, I think there was some climate change in the early years of AD, and So then I think it became harder to make a living as a hunter-gatherer. And there is one school of thought has it that the Jomon are the ancestors of the Ainu, but I think that's a very doubtful. Nobody knows for sure. And I think there are scholars that say that they're not. But there are physical differences between the Jomon and the Yayoi people. And the ancestors of the modern-day Japanese are more likely the Yayoi, who were of Korean ancestry.
There was an interesting woman named Queen Himiko, and she was a shaman. What do we know about the shamanism that was practiced at that time?
Yeah. So Himiko was amazing. The Japanese didn't have writing, but when she was about 50, after 30 years on the throne, she sent envoys to the emperor in China with gifts of slaves and silk. And he then was curious about these little islands, which were their neighbors. So he sent back Chinese students who wrote about the culture. And they said that she was descended from a line of shamans. And she lived around, I think, 120 AD, and ruled for about 50 years. And basically, the point of being a shaman is that you are in touch with the gods. So therefore, you can be sure that there will be harvests. You can ensure that there will be the food supply will be all right. And the Chinese envoys wrote that she was descended from a line of queens, and they called Japan Queen Country because it was ruled by women. So she was not the only shaman queen. There had been others before her, and there was actually at least one other that we know of after her. So the main thing was that she had the mystical power to communicate with the gods, that sort of power. But she probably akin to Shinto, I would think. And also she had temporal power, and she kept herself hidden away, as indeed the emperors did. So she was in her palace, surrounded by, I think, 1,000 women, and then an army to protect her, and watchtowers. Then also, rather like the rulers throughout the ages in Japan, there were other people than her that were her spokespeople. So her brother was her spokesperson. Yeah. And the people, it was said that these people too tattooed themselves, including their faces, which was to protect themselves from fierce fish when they were diving or for food, for fish. And when you see the haniwa, the terracotta figurines from that era, you can derive what kind of costume they wore. And there's also evidence that I think archaeologists have found jewelry and crowns and earrings and so on.
It's fairly easy to distinguish a shrine from a temple. And when foreign tourists come to Japan, they like to visit these places because a shrine, for example, the torii at the shrine, it's one of the symbols, at least how we think about Japan. But I think it's quite difficult or complicated to understand the different roles that Shintoism and Buddhism play in the lives of Japanese people. I got something from your book that I thought could serve as a great foundation for understanding the difference between them, or a starting point, and that is that Shintoism, the gods are for life, and Buddhism is for death. I thought that was a great way to at least begin to distinguish them and understand how they're used in Japanese society.
I mean, yeah, there was a questionnaire this is a famous thing. A questionnaire was sent round to, a selection of Japanese people at one point saying, are you Shinto, Buddhist, Christian? What are you? And they got back a total of, all the things that they got back about a total of 120 or 130%, in that lots of people put tick the Shinto, tick the Buddhism, and tick the Christian. Why the hell not? The Christian God is pretty fussy, isn't he? You've got to believe in him and nobody else and all that, or you'll be in trouble. But the Buddha really doesn't mind. And the Shinto gods really, really don't mind at all. I think the Shinto gods kind of exist in the same way that we exist. They just exist. They're just around. When we were in Japan, my husband, who is Jewish, I was buying myself some amulets, and he said, "What about me?" And he looked up at the sky to make sure that Yahweh wasn't looking, and then he said, "Okay, I'll have some amulets too." So, and the Shinto gods really don't mind. I mean, Yahweh may well be quite fussy, but he's okay. He didn't get blasted by a thunderbolt. He was all right. But I don't think Japanese take it that seriously. But people have in their houses. You have a shrine with your ancestors' photographs, and maybe some of the ashes of your ancestors. And you could probably say that was Buddhist, but you would also have a little Shinto shrine. And they do say that Shinto takes care of you when you're alive, which is why you can go and buy the amulets and you can ring the bell and you can ask for good luck and all this. And Buddhism deals with funerals. But as you know, there's also, there's a whole very, very profound and complex meditation systems. I mean, there's Nichiren and there's Jodo Shinshu. There's all these different Buddhist sects. There's Zen. So these are very profound philosophical systems, and there are people that follow all those systems. But most people that I knew in Japan, they would say, well, their family is Jodo Shinshu, and therefore they are too. It's like, so people in England would say, well, I was Anglican, I'm brought up Anglican. People in England say, I was brought up Catholic. Of course, I don't believe a word of it, but I'm still Catholic. And it's kind of like that. So I think, but it is perfectly okay to be Buddhist, Shinto, and Christian all at the same time. It's kind of more easygoing.
Yeah. I was interested to learn that Japan had connections to the Silk Road even back in the 7th or 8th centuries, and that Buddhism made its way to Japan via this Silk Road, and that as the city of Nara was built with these Buddhist temples, that the markets in Nara there were goods that had come from the Silk Roads. I had no idea that Japan was that plugged into it.
We've just had an exhibition. We've had an exhibition in London at the British Museum on the Silk Roads, and I was extremely happy to see that it begins at Nara. Yeah, Nara was a really special period. I've forgotten the dates now, but about 700 or so AD, I think.
The book is 710 to 794.
Yeah, very specific. But at that time, Japan was very, very plugged into the Silk Road, and the whole, there were all these goods. There were many Silk Roads, not just one Silk Road, but all these goods going back and forth. And when Emperor Shomu built the great Buddha in Nara, people came from India. There was a famous Indian saint who blessed it. And who probably painted in the eye and that sort of thing. And the markets had goods from Rome, from Greece, from Persia. So if you go to the Shoso in Nara, which there are marvelous kind of Persian items there. So it was later on. In fact, it was in the Heian period that Japan became a little more closed and stopped communicating via China. So it was because Japan was connected with China. That was what it was. And so goods flowed back and forth. And so this exhibition in London about the Silk Road actually has, at the one end is Nara, and then it goes via Dunhuang, via Uzbekistan, and it ends up in England at Sutton Hoo. And at the Sutton Hoo burial site, they found item that was made in Syria. At Sutton Hoo. So there was just, but loads of stuff was going back and forth. So basically, it was a much more kind of open, fluid time than people might have imagined. There were certainly loads of goods in the Nara marketplaces from foreign parts. So it was and lots of foreign people. So it was a very colourful, cosmopolitan time.
The city of Heian-kyo, today we call this place Kyoto. It's a very famous, important city in Japanese history. Why did the capital city move to this place called Heian-kyo? This would have been around 794 that this happened?
Yeah, capitals moved for various reasons. There'd been problems in Nara with the priests. And so one point was to undermine the power of the priests. And there was a very famous emperor who was Emperor Kamu. And he wanted to lessen the power of the priests and get power back into the hands of the imperial family. The imperial family very seldom had any power. But he wanted to, at this point, he was a strong guy and he wanted to get power into the hands of the imperial family. And he, first of all, moved the capital to a place called Nagaoka. Any place that you chose had to have the correct feng shui. It had to be geomantically well located with mountains behind, rivers to each side, body of water at the front, and some sort of a plain. Nagaoka had all that. Nagaoka, one of the Fujiwara officials, that's right, was murdered. and Kamu's brother was accused of his murder. There was a lot of worry in those days about getting haunted by ghosts. You really didn't want to get haunted. So the whole site was obviously polluted by this death. So they wanted a fresh start. And the point with the site of Kyoto was it was bigger than where Nara had been. It had all those geomantic things. It had the rivers down each side. It had the mountains at the back. It had the body of water pretty near at the front. And it was also pretty central. So therefore, Kamu wanted very much to expand his empire and to go. The main area where he had not got control was the northeast. It was what we now know as Tohoku. And so Kyoto was a kind of launch pad where he could send his armies to the northeast. And thereby expand the empire. So it was a good sort of central location, and also it was to start afresh in a location that was not haunted by the ghosts of anybody who'd been killed or anything else was a very good thing. And it also was moving away from the priests, because all the priests who had been really trying to usurp power stayed in Nara.
And so it's from this period of time and court life in Heian-kyo in the Heian period that we get the world's first novel, The Tale of Genji. It comes out of this period.
Yeah, The Tale of Genji. It was written around 1000 AD, and it was this very sophisticated society in Kyoto. And over in England, it was well before 1066. It was well before William the Conqueror. So we over here were leading a pretty rugged life. Meanwhile, in Japan, it was extremely sophisticated. And the life of the courtiers is what is written about in the Tale of Genji. Basically, anyone that was not nobility really almost didn't exist. They didn't count. So they were not of interest. But the courtly people led this wonderful life, and in which they would assess a person's quality by things like the perfumes that they mixed. All the men mixed perfumes, and the poetry that they wrote. Everybody could write poetry, and their handwriting, their calligraphy, and their clothes. So the women, they would wear like 12 layer kimonos, color coordinated at the throat, and the wrist and the hem. And you would judge somebody by that kind of criterion. And in this society, the men learnt Chinese characters because they were considered to be more intelligent, which was a big mistake. So the men would write quite dull poetry in Chinese. The women were only taught the kana, and the idea was that women should be very pious and they should be able to read the scriptures, the sutras. So that was why they were taught the kana. But these were very sophisticated court ladies, extremely sophisticated, and they used this writing system to keep diaries and to write books like the Pillow Book of Seishonagon, and to write about the world that they lived in, which is why we know a lot about it. So they'd write all about their relationships and their feelings, and how women never let themselves be seen by men. So there's another really wonderful book called As I Crossed a Bridge of Dreams by another court lady who I think nobody knows her actual name. She's called the Lady of Sarashina. And she writes about how it was nighttime. She was behind a screen, and this man passed by on the veranda outside, and they had a conversation. And he had a really marvelous voice. And he also, I think he actually made up a few poems. And she was a great poetess. And she fell completely in love with him. I don't think she never got to see him. And she knew that nothing could ever happen. So it's a really, really tragic story. And at one point, she knew he was going to be in the palace where she lived again, but she was too shy to go out there and see him. So she never saw him, but she never forgot him. And the irony is that he was a great nobleman, and she knew that he was way above her. So, of course, they could never get together. But he would have been entirely forgotten forever if she hadn't written about him in her immortal book. So anyway, the pinnacle of all of this was the Tale of Genji, which was written by Murasaki Shikibu, which is not her name. We don't know her name, but it's the name of her main character. And it's about the shining Prince Genji, who was unbelievably handsome and wrote fantastic poetry, great mixture of perfumes, very, very charming. his fatal flaw was that he fell in love the whole time. And he also, which is very, I think, very typical of Japan, was that it doesn't have a happy ending. There's always a tragic ending, and there's always a kind of darkness inside these people. And Genji he loses the woman he loves, and he dies. And, it's quite a tragic story. And unlike Beowulf, which we were all listening to, which is all about fighting monsters and battles and daring do, Genji is all about feelings and relationships, and it's kind of more like Proust. It's more like Jane Austen, and it's known as the world's first novel. And it's also totally coloured Japanese culture for the rest of history for the next 1,000 years. And it's wonderful. And if your listeners haven't read it, they should forget what everybody else says and read the Arthur Waley translation, which is the first translation. The other translations are probably much more accurate, and they have lots of footnotes. But, if you read the Arthur Waley translation, it reads like a novel and you're totally gripped and you fall completely in love with Genji.
I want to ask a couple basic questions in case people aren't familiar with some Japanese terms. Would you mind explaining what the emperor is compared to what a shogunate is and a daimyo is? What are some of the roles that these positions played in Japanese society?
So the emperor is traditionally believed to be the direct descendant of the sun goddess. It's the same family, all the way down to our current emperor, to the current Naruhito, who's our present emperor. There have been times in Japanese history when the emperor has had power. Certain emperors have had power. Normally, they tend not to have power. And almost from way, way, way back, there's normally been a family or some people that wield power instead of the emperor. So in the Heian period, it was the Fujiwara family. And in earlier periods, it was the Soga family. And now too, the emperor's role has changed to some extent, but he's still, what he is he doesn't normally have temporal power, but he is enormously respected. And he does sort of represent, I suppose, the gods, being descended himself from the sun goddess. So he has a kind of religious element to him that Western rulers do not have. So throughout a lot of Japanese history, he has been hugely respected. Then the shoguns were basically of the military class, and the first one was probably Yoritomo. So they were warriors who united as much of Japan as they could. And so in the early years, it wasn't all of the Japanese islands, but it got bigger and bigger. And I think the first person to have the title of barbarian quelling generalissimo, which is what shogun means, was Sadano Wei no something or other. But after him, Minamoto no Yoritomo was the first real shogun. And that was a title given by the emperor to the ruler of Japan, which was basically recognizing that he was the temporal power. And after that, it became customary that the shogun could only be of the Minamoto family. And so Yoritomo was uniting Japan in the 1100s. And then after him, there's a period of great warfare, and eventually the regional warlords were given the name daimyo. So the daimyo are regional warlords, and the shogun would be the overall lord. And some of these warlords, such as Oda Nobunaga, did a big job of uniting Japan, but he could not be a shogun because he was not of the Minamoto family. And eventually Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara defeated his fellow warlords conclusively and became lord of all of Japan. So he has the title of shogun. So at the very top you have the emperor. Below him, in theory, you have the shogun, but the shogun wields temporal power. And then below that you have the daimyo, who are like regional lords. So the daimyo, it's kind of like in the reign of Elizabeth I. You had the Earl of Leicester and the Earl of Essex and people like this. So all the counties in England had their own lord, and they were daimyo, basically, those guys.
So the castles that are all across Kyushu and Honshu, would the daimyo be in charge of that area and have that castle?
The castles were built by the daimyo. And the first great castle of that sort was built by Oda Nobunaga, who lived throughout in the 1500s. He was almost the exact same period as Elizabeth I. And he had a marvelous castle called Azuchi Castle that was just outside Kyoto, which then got destroyed in warfare. And his successor, who was called Hideyoshi, built a much more spectacular castle, which was Osaka Castle. And that kind of model of the castles with the beautiful white walls and then the sort of sloping like pagoda-like roofs, that became the standard way that castles were built. And then the greatest castle of the whole lot was Edo Castle, which was built by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was the one who won the war in 1600 and who ruled Japan, kept Japan at peace, and presided over an incredible renaissance, cultural renaissance of 250 years.
In the 1700s, we get a word to describe someone known as an arts person, and this word was geisha. Who were these women, and why were they called geisha?
So the first people to use the word geisha were men, and they were entertainers, and they called themselves arts person, which is geisha, or taikomochi, which is bearer of the drum. And they lived in the pleasure quarter. The pleasure quarters were outside of the big cities, and they were a place where you could contain the unruly elements. So they were the people that lived there. There would be courtesans, prostitutes, and a whole staff of cleaners, cooks, entertainers, and lots of other people. And men would come there, probably actually not that much for pleasure, but for culture. That was the whole center of the culture of the era. So men would come there for pleasure. And while they were waiting to see the courtesan, there would be entertainers who they would have to pay, and they would be men. But then this was not a whole lot about sex, actually. Westerners are very obsessed with sex and think it was all to do with sex, but it actually wasn't. So it was to do with, for example, the courtesans, the early courtesans would have been amazing dancers, like dancers at the Royal Ballet. And they would have been, or some would have been amazing singers, like opera singers, and some would have been amazing musicians. And eventually, over time moves on, and the jobs began to kind of divide. And some of these women realized that they didn't even have to offer to sell their bodies because they could make a perfectly good living with their professions. And they were professional women. And they were very proud of their skill, of their musicianship, or their dance ability, or their singing ability. And they, in around the 1750s, took the name geisha, and it stuck. So then women became geisha. But they dressed very differently from courtesans. Courtesans wore their obi, their cummerbund, tied at the front. And the implication was if you were extremely rich and extremely lucky, you might possibly get to untie that. And they also wore a lot of all the hairpins in the woodblock prints and all the fancy clothing. Those would more likely be courtesans, whereas the geisha were much more modest. And they had their obis tied at the back. And their traditional instrument is the shamisen, which is it looks like a banjo, which you play with a plectrum. So when you see a woman with a shamisen in a woodblock print, that's a geisha. You know that's a geisha. And they of course, if they wanted to have a lover, they could have a lover, just as any of us can have a lover. But that was not their job. Their job was to be performers and entertainers. And I mean, I met lots of geisha. I wrote a book about geisha, and I remember one of them. She was like probably 45, so she was very accomplished. She was a fantastic dancer, and she was incredibly excited because there was a famous teacher was going to come to town. So it's just like, you and I, if we're doing some art form, we want to kind of pursue that skill. We want to learn more and more and more. We want to go to great teachers, and they to this day, geisha, make an ample living with their arts. And they do not need to sell their bodies, not at all. It's not part of the job at all. So yeah, and they're actually fantastic women. I know I've met quite a lot and feel very proud to walk down the road with a geisha.
When we think of Japan in the Tokugawa period, as Westerners, we think of it as a time when Japan was closed off to trade and foreign influence. And in many respects they were, but there were still connections to China and Korea, and also channels at the south of Kyushu where things like books and information trickled in. When Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with their ships in the mid-19th century, the Japanese were not at all ignorant to what was going on in the world, were they?
So I think one of the things that Commodore Perry did was one of the very early Japanese, just when Commodore Perry arrived, was invited onto his ship. And the Americans, they showed him a globe. They said, "Look, this is the world." And and this Japanese guy said, "Oh yeah, I know. I mean, this is America here, right? This is English here, right?" And I mean, they knew all about it. They knew that Britain was bombarding China to force them to buy opium. And the first Opium War happened before Perry arrived, and they knew all about that. So therefore, that affected how they felt about about this invasion by the Americans. So when Perry arrived, Perry's threat was his enormous gunships. I mean, enormous, terrifyingly huge. It's just like the creatures from outer space arriving in mammoth spaceships. I mean, or like I always think of Independence Day. Do you remember that film with those spaceships the size of a city? It was kind of like that. It was like, oh my God! It was like, oh shit! It was really bad. So that was that. So he had this enormous ships. But after he left, and one of the last sort of conditions was that the Americans should be allowed to send a consul. And I think the Japanese guys that agreed to that didn't even dare tell the shogunate, the government, that they'd done that because they were so scared. But they'd had to agree to that. And so Townsend Harris turned up along with his secretary, Henry Hugheskin. And it was just these two guys, just two blokes. So the Japanese could very easily have killed them if they'd felt like it. But they were very civilized people. They didn't just go around killing people for no reason. But so Townsend Harris did not have enormous gunships. But what Townsend Harris said was, what the British Navy has done and is doing in China. They were doing it right then. It was the Second Opium War. And he said, you better be nice to me, because if you're not, the British will come. So the whole opening of Japan, it's often phrased in polite terms, that Commodore Perry opened Japan. No, Commodore Perry threatened the Japanese and forced them to agree to the first opening of the first treaty ports. And then Townsend Harris, again, with threats, forced them to agree to the opening of more treaty ports, as indeed they were doing in China. They were forcing them to agree to the opening of treaty ports.
I have lots more I'd love to ask you, but I see we're running low on time. Before I ask my last couple of questions, though, I wanted to tell you that I really enjoyed learning about the Battle of Hakodate, and that this spring I'm going to drive down there and search around the harbor and museums to learn more about that history.
You can go, I've forgotten the name of the place. It's across the peninsula. You take a train to where you can go and see the ship, the Kaiomaru. You can go and see it. It's there. Okay. It begins with E. Great. It's a five-letter words in the English alphabet beginning with E. But the ship is called the Kaiomaru, and it was sank in a storm, which was one of the major reasons why in the end the Tokugawa resistance didn't succeed, because the Kaiomaru sank. The winds there are unbelievably strong, but they found it. It sank in 1868. They found it around 1990, and they brought it up. So you can see it. Yeah, you should do that. It's a train ride from. You could drive over there.
Oh, thanks for the suggestions. Yeah, I'll definitely do that. So, for the sake of time, I'll shorten the next 100 years to a couple of brief sentences that won't even come close to doing justice to the importance of this history. Japan has a rapid period of modernization, and their empire eventually clashes with the United States, which resulted in a terrible war for both sides. But in the end, the United States is victorious, and Japan is morally, spiritually, and physically exhausted. Its infrastructure is flattened, and its economy is in ruins. You mentioned something in the book called the three treasures, which were a TV, a refrigerator, and a washing machine. How long after the Second World War did it take to reach a level of prosperity where the average Japanese family could realistically attain these kinds of things?
Basically, after the war, as has happened in Japan quite a few times, a lot of right after the war, MacArthur turned up, and he said, let's make Japan democratic, freedom of speech. Everybody just talk about anything you like. So of course they all became Marxist immediately, and MacArthur thought, oh, that wasn't what I had in mind at all. So then he clamped down. So there had been a lot of youth rising up, and it was around the 1960s. So the question was, there were so many rebellions. And one thing was that Japanese were protesting against the American bases. They wanted to get the Americans out. They had not yet succeeded, but they wanted to get the American bases out. And there were big protests. And there was a man called Kishi Nobusuke, who was actually the grandfather of Abe, Prime Minister Abe. And he thought the answer was, bring in the Yakuza, because he was very friendly with the Yakuza, and kind of beat these people up. But that didn't really help. So the protesting continued. And then Ikeda had the brilliant idea. He thought it was very simple. He thought, if they're all incredibly prosperous and happy, then they won't rebel anymore. So let's make Japan rich. And he made a promise that within 10 years from, I think it was the mid 1960s, everybody could have the three treasures. They could all have the television and the what was it, the washing machine, and the was the other one, I forgot. Refrigerator. Yeah. But it took less than 10 years. It didn't take very long. And the economy just was booming. So he created a booming economy, and it worked. I mean, there've always been rebels in Japan. There's always been an alternative society, but basically the big rebellions just faded away because everybody was happy and prosperous, and they didn't need to protest any longer. Everybody could have them. And as you know, because you live there, that Japan is very prosperous.
The last question I want to ask you is about how Japanese culture has been incorporated into the world. How successful has Japan been at exporting their culture abroad?
Oh, I think very successful. There's well, for a start, there's the Japan Society that organises all sorts of things. In London, there's a Japan House. There used to be Japan festivals, but also I think there were just lots of people who've lived in Japan. I mean, Japanese culture is, as you know, it's very fascinating. And lots of people have studied tea ceremony, or they've studied flower arrangement, and then they go home and then they start to teach it. I think people are well aware also of things like manga and anime. There's a whole other youth culture, like cosplay. I mean, it's not just older people busy doing tea ceremony. It's kind of young people wearing Japanese fashion. I mean, I think Japan has a real kind of image. Like Japanese fashion is really distinctive and kind of interesting. So people who are just interested in fashion will come across Japanese fashion, and then that will make them interested in Japan. I think it was it Abe who realized that rather than trying to win wars, that you can win hearts and minds by exporting Japanese culture. So I think there's gonna be an expo in Osaka, isn't there, in the spring, in April, I think.
That's right.
And so people will know about that. But I think there's a lot of, I don't think it's just because I happen to live in a Japan world, which I do, but I mean, I think there is a general knowledge of Japan. And as I said at the beginning of this conversation, when I came back in the early 80s, I was teaching Japanese cooking. That was how I started sort of keeping myself alive when I was back. And a journalist came along, and she wrote an article about it, and she was very nice. But the article she wrote, Lesley Downer forced me to eat raw fish. It was disgusting. That's the early 80s. So things have changed. And now, of course, everybody eats raw. Now you can go to Sainsbury's and Marks and Spencer's and you can get your sushi. So lots of things that were once outlandish have become absolutely normal. So I think the Japanese have succeeded in creating an image of Japan as an interesting place, not a bland place at all, a very interesting, very distinctive place. Out of which nearly everybody I know, including lots of people who'd never been to Japan before, they're all going to Japan. Everybody's going to Japan.
So, I wanted to say that reading this book, The Shortest History of Japan, in addition to it being concise and beautifully written, I didn't just enjoy reading the book, but felt inspired to pull out the language books and history books and further my own knowledge on Japan. So there was an enthusiasm there that I thought was contagious, and I appreciated.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm pleased. I mean, that was what I wanted to do, because I actually, to me, I do love it. It's not just kind of a job or something. I mean, what I wanted to do was exactly that. I mean, history books can be really interesting, but their academic books tend to be on the dry side.
Well, Lesley, it was a pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, and nice questions.
Yeah.